Welcome everybody to this year's annual Constitution Day talk at Diablo Valley College. I'll be hosting and speaking at the event today with my colleagues Sangha Nyogi and Albert Ponce. So I'm going to introduce them more formally in a moment. Special thanks to Todd Farr and everybody at the Student Life Office for putting this on every year. It's an honor to be invited back. I've given a number of these talks over the years. My area of focus is usually somewhere around the First or Fourth Amendment. Not that the other amendments don't matter, and particularly in the times that we live, there's a lot of relevance to that document, not just with the Bill of Rights, but with the document, the Constitution in its entirety. And given that it's something that we refer to historically as a living document that we interpret generation to generation, it's really a timely and great exercise that we're able to put on these kinds of presentations and these talks. We're going to hear a little bit I'll be talking a little bit about perspectives on First Amendment and free press. We'll also, of course, be hearing from our other guests specifically about within the First Amendment, there are 5 specific protections, and we'll be talking about the rights to peaceably assemble, the petition for grievances, and so forth. So that said, let me introduce myself. Again, I'm Mickey Huff. I am co-chair of history. I'm professor of social science and history at Diablo Valley College. I am also chair of the journalism program here. In the journalism program, the Inquirer is doing some good work, broke a really big story for the district and the college today. So please do check out those emails from our new full-time faculty and advisor, Professor Michael Levitin. I'd like to introduce my other guests today, my colleagues and friends, of course. First is Dr. Sangha Nyogi, professor of sociology here at Diablo Valley College. Sangha acquired her PhD in sociology from the University of California, Davis, has a master's in international relations from Bristol University in the UK. In grad school, Sangha specialized in race and ethnicity and immigration. She has presented at numerous conferences and published in UK journals, Cultural Sociology, and Oxford Encyclopedia of American Social History. She is the initiator and co-director of the Social Justice Studies major at Diablo Valley College. And Dr. Nyogi is also a co-chair of the Student Equity and Success Committee. She is also an advisor for the Student Club Women of Color Association at DVC. And Sangha, are you not also our rep in social science for the Senate?
I am indeed.
One head and too many hats. I relate. Thanks so much for all that you do and all that you bring to the DVC community, and specifically for all of our students. Dr. Nyogi, welcome.
Thank you.
Also, I would like to welcome Dr. Albert Ponce, Political Science and Social Justice. I should also say, too, both Sangha and Albert are the co-directors of our social justice program here at Diablo Valley College, and I am honored to teach with them the Intro to Social Justice Studies course, teaching that with Albert this semester. Dr. Ponce is professor of political science, co-director of social justice studies here at DVC, like I just said. Professor Ponce earned his PhD from the Department of Political Science, specializing in race, ethnicity, and politics and political theory at the University of California, Los Angeles. His focus on racial violence situates race as a political technology in producing the legal exclusion and disposability of migrants and vulnerable populations. At DVC, Albert mentors students in the Puente and Umoja programs and advises Men of Color Association, or MOCA, Social Justice Club, and Scholars for Justice Club, which is formerly incarcerated students. Dr. Ponce also teaches ethnic studies in LTCC's incarcerated student program at Folsom and High Desert State Prisons. Professor Ponce is also a member of the Dreamers Alliance, building solidarity and resources for undocumented students beyond the campus, as well as a member of DVC's Racial Justice Task Force. Again, Dr. Ponce, a person wearing many hats in the DVC community and beyond. Thank you and welcome, Dr. Ponce, for joining us today. So I believe there are 2 other folks that you wanted to pass the baton to do brief introductions. So Sangha and Albert, please do that.
Yes, we are so proud to have 2 of our social justice majors here. They are already recognized throughout our campus as student leaders. So I'm going to first invite Daniela. Just introduce yourself, Daniela.
Hello, my name is Daniela. This is my second year at DVC, and I'm majoring in political science and social justice. I'm also the student worker for the social justice department, and I also run the social justice club at DVC.
And then we have Erica Babel with us.
Hi, my name is Erica. I am a social justice and sociology major. I'm in my second or third year now. I am co-president of Scholars for Justice. As mentioned, I'm gonna go ahead and do a little club pitch here. We are a club for formerly incarcerated or people who have been impacted by the criminal justice system, or even allies. If you're interested in being a part of supporting or changing the stigma around that, we would love to have you. We will start up our meetings on Thursdays from 9 to 10 a.m. Hopefully within the next 2 weeks, we'll be up and running. You can email me, or I don't know how to, I guess I could put my email in the chat to, if you're interested, just send me an email and I can connect you with the club. I do social justice because in the sociology classes, I started to see them shedding light on things that I was experiencing or seeing within my life that have been troubles that I've had to overcome. And I really want to be a part of the solution. So I feel like this is what I can do to hopefully one day be a part of the bigger solution. So.
Thanks so much.
That's wonderful. Yeah.
Yes, thank you both for being here, and thanks for all the work that you're doing both on and off campus. And of course, today is a great opportunity, Constitution Day, to talk about that living document, not just how we deal with it in the classroom as a matter of an academic subject, historically or through political science and the other disciplines, but it's obviously something that exists in the real world. We may not always feel like it's a living document, depending upon how far back one goes, going back to the beginning of our country. The Constitution, one might argue, has certainly been there to be both used for interesting and sometimes contradictory purposes, but it's also been trampled and ignored by members of all parties in our political system, and that's something that we want to call attention to, and we want to remember that we have rights, but rights in the abstract is a very different thing than rights in the real world. When we go to actually exercise these rights, specifically those ensconced in the First Amendment, that's where we kind of see consequences of exercising those rights. And so today, I know a few of the things that we're going to deal with involve the First Amendment. Just very quickly, of course, so people know that the Constitution, of course, was ratified September 17, 1787. The Bill of Rights was proposed and passed in 1789. It was ratified, the Bill of Rights, or the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, were ratified December 15th, 1791. And it didn't take very long by the time we get to the second president in John Adams that we already see the First Amendment being trampled through what were called the Alien and Sedition Acts. That's in 1798. So we're going to be riffing on some of those themes here today, and I'll try to be brief, though that's not one of my strong points. But I want to pass things over to my colleagues, Drs. Niogi and Ponce. They have a lot to add about some things happening in our culture and our political climate right now around First Amendment issues. But I want to at least start off by reading the First Amendment. The Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Of course, there's a lot to the Constitution we could be discussing. There are many related issues in the Constitution that will overlap with today's conversations, particularly with the Fourth Amendment and the right to privacy. But we're going to be focusing a lot on the First Amendment, my area of expertise in terms of my academic publications. My work as director of Project Censored and president of the Media Freedom Foundation. you can learn more at projectcensored.org, focuses on press rights, speech rights, and rights of expression as the court has interpreted them. But those dovetail and overlap significantly with the right to peaceably assemble, petition government for redress of grievances. And that's something that's going to come up a little later in today's presentations. But it's significant to note that these amount over the years through Supreme Court interpretation, these amount to what we declare are public rights to be heard and to protest government policy. And when we say protest, let's also be careful to not only assume that protests are negative in terms of we have to assemble to be against something. We also assemble as constituents in a society to be for something, right? And to be for changes that we want to see take place in our culture. So it's important, I think, to reframe some of that discussion in the beginning, because when we hear about protests, we immediately are thinking about negative things, and our media really frame them in negative ways. And our political culture, too, kind of pushes that on. Just very recently, the Attorney General, William Barr, suggested that around the country, states should seriously consider trying protesters for sedition. So it's kind of hearkening back to 1798. And of course, the conflation with protesters and rioters is a repeated semantic tool that's used to oppress people that are protesting oppression. We'll hear more about that from our other guests. So my angle coming into this, though, today is on the very significance of the free speech and free press, especially, arguments here coming out of the First Amendment. I'll try to wrap these up in the next 5 or so minutes, if possible, to pass over. But I wanted to call attention to what I see as a crisis. And I see it's interesting that people are already chiming in the comments. I'll try to remark upon those as we go along, but we'll certainly get to them later. So I see Andy has got a remark there, and just please also just bookmark that, and let's definitely bring it up later. And I know our other guests are going to talk about some of these issues. So, but please feel free to use the comment to take notes as we're going along, as those will be saved with the recording. So yes, it's very interesting that we need to really think about how media frame things for us. And but one of the interesting things that's going on right now is that there is actually a war on the media itself. And I know that the corporate press has sort of played into this narrative with President Trump's enemy of the people rhetoric regarding the press. But what I'm talking about is actually far more nefarious. What I'm talking about is the open, brazen, and wanton assault on free press rights. And that's been happening for some time in the United States and around the world. Reporters Without Borders in Europe and France repeatedly reports year after year the most dangerous places in the world surrounding press freedom issues. And I am not proud to say that the United States has crept its way into the top 5 most dangerous places around the world to be a practicing journalist. And if you're not familiar with that, I'll be putting links into the chat area as we go on today. But these are really serious issues. I want to call attention specifically, there is a site, there's an organization, the Press Freedom Organization, that has a project called Press Freedom Tracker. The website is pressfreedomtracker.us. And in the months after the George Floyd killing in Minneapolis by the police there was a massive uptick, not just in protests around the United States, but in mass violence against journalists. More than 700 journalists have reported press freedom violations since late May of this year alone. And this is a massive uptick in the percentage that we've seen in previous years. Over 100 journalists have been arrested, dozens have been pepper sprayed, scores have been tear gassed. Let's remember, too, that tear gas under international law is something that's considered a chemical weapon, and now numerous cities are finally banning its use. What we also see, by the way, as an aside that I know my esteemed colleagues will address more, is that much of the violence that's being meted out in these cities, in these protests, is actually coming from the state and from other instigators, not actually from protesters themselves. In fact, another recent study just showed that of the Black Lives Matter protests where there are mounting acts of violence, 93% of the acts were not committed by people who were active participants in the protest. In other words, a vast, vast majority of people participating are participating peaceably, and that's something that we need to focus on. If it bleeds, it leads, our media says, and so a lot of the focus goes there, right? But in places like Portland alone, there's charges against 30 journalists being charged with a variety of different crimes. About 84% of the crimes committed against 700 incidents of violence against journalists, 84% were perpetrated by law enforcement. And even when removing the 100 arrests and detainments of journalists, we're left with the police being involved in nearly 82% of these cases. Now, please also do not read this as a blanket statement that this is something that all police officers are engaged in and that police forces are openly engaged in a war against journalists. That's not what I'm saying either. And the Constitution is an interesting document because it's quite vague at times, and there's a lot of gray area where we can discuss within. One of the things I want to do here today with the brief time I have is just call out that this is an increasingly significant problem that we're facing in our society, where we're literally shooting the messengers. One of the most high-profile cases that's happening right now under everyone's noses is the trial of Julian Assange of WikiLeaks in the UK, where he is not receiving an open and fair trial. Daniel Ellsberg, the famous whistleblower, just testified there yesterday. This week on the Project Censored show, I discussed this matter with Kevin Gostola of Shadowproof.com, who's been one of the only people that's covering the importance of whistleblowers, publishers, and journalists. And we discuss how the WikiLeaks trial, he's being put up on 17 counts of violating the Espionage Act. So let that sink in here. Right? There's been no acts of violence or no threats carried out against anyone that was outed in any of the WikiLeaks documents, and 0 of the WikiLeaks documents have been proven unfactual or erroneous since they began being made public over 10 years ago. So I hope that people will pay a lot more attention to what's going on right now with the Assange trial and with WikiLeaks. And this is not about a personality issue or about whether or not we like or one likes WikiLeaks. It's repeatedly been the case that people from Julian Assange to Thomas Drake to Edward Snowden to Chelsea Manning and others have ritually been thrown under the bus, not only by the establishment and political structure, but also by the so-called free press itself, where the New York Times and the Washington Post, the supposed papers of record in the liberal media, routinely attack these people as traitors or worse, while they simultaneously use their leaked documents to publish Pulitzer Prize-winning reports. I guess they get it both ways. What I would like to do here, at least, is suggest that there are very important issues happening around press freedom right now. The Assange case is a very important one. Consortium News and Shadowproof are 2 places where you can really get up-to-date information on what's happening there. There's an effort to extradite Assange to the US, and almost all the people testifying have clearly stated, given that none other than the current presidential candidate for the Democratic Party, former Vice President and Senator Joe Biden, recently once again referred to Julian Assange as a high-tech terrorist, which means there's really no chance that these people would ever get a fair trial in the United States under these kinds of charges. We even had people in the CIA referring to people like Assange as a traitor. It's very fascinating to use those legal terms, given that he isn't a US citizen and is in fact from Australia, but apparently those details don't matter either. At any rate, there's a lot of things that I could go into in greater detail regarding the media and protections for journalists, but the protections don't just come into place all on their own. And if people are not informed about what's happening around them, they can't really mobilize to peaceably assemble or petition government for their grievances. So one of my favorite quotes from former FCC chairperson Nicholas Johnson about your second priority is that regardless of what your primary area of interest is, and let's talk about civic affairs and your civic pursuits in the public sphere, whatever your first area of interest is, if your second one isn't press freedom, free press principles, or media democracy, you're likely to gain very little ground in your first area of interest, because we need information. We need factually sourced, transparent information as the lifeblood of our democratic republic in order to make informed choices and decisions, because it's already clear that we're not always going to agree about everything, and that's fine. We don't have to agree. But we do at least have to understand what facts are and what sources mean. And we need to really respect the free press as the fourth estate that really helps us understand and mitigate these challenges. And we as the public need to hold the fourth estate accountable, which is why we also need to watch how the corporate and establishment media frame these issues for us and bring in the many independent voices that fill in the gaps that corporate media leave out. And so with that, I want to turn things over to Dr. Niogi and Ponce, who have presentations that particularly bring things up to the present with the recent cultures of protest. And again, they'll be focusing a lot on critical race theory and issues around Black Lives Matter. But I also want to call out and remind people in comments and later, we are also dealing with lockdown protests, economic protests. There are groups and constituencies in our society that are very concerned about mask provisions, about issues surrounding vaccinations and public health. So there's a lot of things that we really need to consider, not just those that are our primary areas of interest. And I want to make sure that despite the fact that we're all focusing on our main issues and the areas where we have expertise, I want to make sure that everybody knows that this is an open forum and that you're openly invited to have your say when we're done with our presentations here this afternoon. So again, I want to thank everybody. Thank Todd Farr, our Dean, Obed Vazquez, all of my great and wonderful colleagues for participating today, and thank all of you for coming to participate, all 90 of you. So thanks so much for showing up in our Zoom session today. And with that, Dr. Niogi, please take it away.
All right, Mickey Huff is always a tough act to follow. That's why I have pretty pictures for you. Yeah, so these two are like absolutely my brothers here at DVC, and that's why this talk is especially special, that I can engage with them and with all of you folks who took the time to be here today. So thank you for that. My email is right there. So if you have any questions, you want to continue the conversation, you're absolutely welcome to email me. This is a quick overview of what I'm hoping I can talk to you about today. One is, of course, the myth making that we do about the civil rights movement in our nation. Already we are seeing from polls, surveys, that there's a white lash against the Black Lives Matter movement. For a while it was trendy, which is why we keep emphasizing you need to be here for the movement, not the moment, right? And the myth, the story we like to tell in our nation is, if you want to do it right, if you want to protest, go ahead, but you got to be like Dr. King. Be peaceful, be respectful, right? So we want to unpack that a little bit. I want to talk about how for Black, Indigenous people of color, free speech has always been just theoretical, right? They've never had it quite implemented for this group. My third point here in the overview you'll see is probably the most contentious one here. This is why I love that we are here together to debate and discuss. Our whole point, I guess the whole point is debate is crucial in any democracy, right? So I want to make this assertion that the First Amendment has been co-opted for perpetuating hate speech and white supremacy in the current moment, right? And it has been throughout our history. So that's something that we need to examine. And then finally, I'm going to use CRT, which is critical race theory, as a way of making certain suggestions as being a bridge between this free speech, hate speech debate. And I'm sure my comrade Ponce will add on his views on that as well. But I wanted to start off with this. So you see the image there of Dr. King, who's in front of all this chaos, right? And it's the quote there says, "I plan to lead another nonviolent march tomorrow," as a way of saying, look, what a hypocrite, right? He says he's nonviolent. This was in 1967, an image to scare white Americans, right? But then you fast forward to present times, the image of Dr. King seems quite a bit different. It says, "Never burned one building, never robbed one store, never destroyed one town, changed the world." Right? But the Harris poll in '68 noted that King had an unfavorability rating among Americans of nearly 75%, right? So he was most wanted, right? It's completely different from how we imagine it today. And the folks who did, the student civil rights leaders who initiated sit-ins and freedom rides, saw nonviolence as militant. It was confrontational by design. And often this sort of protest is all about breaking the laws, which is why King himself went to jail several times. So I think it's really important, again, the story that we tell and the whole respectability politics associated with it, about how and why we should be protesting, right? And I'm sure we'll talk about that more in the Q&A as well, because as Mickey already pointed out, the media has a certain narrative about it as well. And then we go on to our current administration. Wow, his take on the First Amendment, right? So he demands the First Amendment right of free speech for himself on privately owned social media, and then 4 days later declares war on the people gathered on public property, right? And the people who, in their own words, are there to assemble to petition the government for redress of grievances. As Professor Huff pointed out, that's exactly what the First Amendment is. And then you have all these obscene things happening where you have the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals last year approved an opinion holding that anyone who organizes a protest can be sued and thus possibly bankrupted if someone else present commits an illegal act. So if you want to chill speech, right, that's the way to go, right? And so you have the images there of BLM protests that are happening nationwide, right? Indigenous folks, the first Americans, also have experienced this throughout, and these are just a couple of examples that we're using here. But unfortunately, there are too many, right? Where you have state-sanctioned violence to quell free speech of Black Indigenous people of color. And so here I'm just talking about Standing Rock, thanks to, again, amazing journalism, right? And folks from Democracy Now! And other independent journalists covering this issue with drones. And I don't know if this is still in our imagination or not, if we've forgotten about this. But this was the Dakota Access Pipeline, right? That was rerouted from upstream, predominantly privileged areas of Bismarck, downstream through the treaty lands and potentially polluting the water supply, drinking supply of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. So when the tribe protested, guard dogs, freezing cold water, hypothermia, the works, right? And let's see, the recent most thing I dug up on this was July 2020, a district court judge has issued a ruling for the pipeline to be shut down and emptied of oil pending a new environmental review. The tribe is still fighting this on the ground, right? So here's the argument that I'm making, right? Coextensive with the criminalization of racial justice protesters is the long history of non-interference with the assembly rights of white supremacist actors. The history of oppression explains why defamation, invasion of privacy, fraud, and are exempt from free speech guarantees, while racist and sexist verbal assaults are not. And I think this is at the heart of our debate and discussion today, because of course we all understand this is a sacred right. This is what makes us a fully functioning democracy. And on the other hand, we're also talking about how power relationships make it really difficult and impossible for members of socially disempowered groups to respond to certain types of speech. And I'm thinking in my head also of the RAV versus St. Paul 1992 Supreme Court decision that struck down the city ordinance that made it a crime to place a burning cross or swastika anywhere. And so we have numerous examples of this happening. So critical race scholars are making this argument that hate speech is rarely an invitation to dialogue. The idea that talking back to the aggressor is wise, sensible, or even safe lacks a certain sense of reality and kind of reveals different levels of privilege that each of us possess. This is revealed if you look at the perspective. Your perspective shifts a lot depending on your social location in society. In this one, it's just covering the racial group, right? And so opinions differ a lot about can society prohibit hate speech and protect free speech. Under the current First Amendment jurisprudence, and of course, we can again clarify this more, we have experts here, hate speech can only be criminalized when it directly incites imminent criminal activity or consists of specific threats of violence targeted against a person or group. Now, it can be far too easy for people not in risk groups to dismiss speech as empty words or as something which is at worst the kind of spiteful bullying any sensible person would ignore. But our right to safety must include psychological as well as physical safety, and a right not to feel threatened is fundamental to our freedom. Trump very recently has gone after critical race theory, right? Calling it a divisive anti-American propaganda. Immediately that makes it a badge of honor, right? If Trump doesn't like it, that it has something meaningful to offer. And so, of course, we don't have enough time here to go into critical race theory in detail, but I just wanted to highlight that basically it brings up how the power structures in this country are based on white privilege and white supremacy, that racism is ordinary, it's not an anomaly, that there's an interest convergence, right? That essentially that was an idea brought forward by Derek Bell, right? Who says that Black people achieve civil rights victories only when white and Black interests converge, right? It doesn't happen out of the benevolence of the folks in power. Race is a social construct, has no biological basis. The idea that social scientists in the so-called objective research often maintain status quo. And then finally, I think most important for our discussion today, the notion that whites have actually been the recipients of civil rights legislation throughout our history. So CRT scholars are really challenging this idea of law as neutral, legal things as neutral, right? And I think, to be fair, Professor Hafiz is pointing out that this is a live document open to interpretation. The way that it has been interpreted as neutral and how it applies universally is just fake, right? It's just a lie, because too often we use those frameworks of colorblindness, neutrality, meritocracy to maintain status quo. So as implemented currently, I'm making the argument, and I'm of course expecting pushback today, that instead of helping to achieve healthy and robust debate, the First Amendment actually serves to preserve the inequities of the status quo. And again, I qualify that by saying how it's implemented currently. There's no such thing as an objective, neutral interpretation in law. And I'm also saying that, and this is offered by CRT as folks who are looking at this, studying this empirically, and saying which kinds of racist speech should be prohibited. There are three qualifiers here, right? something that communicates a message of racial inferiority against a historically oppressed group in an intentionally persecutory and hateful way. So again, I don't want us to take this lightly. I teach sociology, I teach social justice. We learn through discomfort, right? Through debate and discussion. This is very specific. We're not talking about necessarily speech that is offensive, that's obnoxious. No, that's not what we're saying, right? In fact, we say, let's create brave spaces, all of that. This, again, I'm pointing out, is very specific. And incitement is always an empirical question, right? And it must be decided case by case. Yet social research can provide courts with a protocol for a context-specific analysis of political speech. Social researchers who study political communication, persuasion, and the impact of discriminatory language can offer evidence-based guidance about the kinds of speech and circumstances that are most likely to produce undesirable effects. And when I say undesirable effects, we've already cataloged these connections between hate speech and spike in hate crimes, violence, and so on. For instance, we know that speech from political authority figures is more likely to influence behavior, especially if a figure is perceived by their audience as charismatic, if their speech is characterized by graphic imagery that draws on powerful historical narratives. An audience that is experiencing economic, political uncertainty is more vulnerable to language that scapegoats a minority population. Speakers that cultivate fear and resentment against target outgroups, right, can motivate acts of violence and so on. So I'm saying let's use data and research to figure this stuff out. Meanwhile, of course, as all of that is happening, we know that folks from the Southern Poverty Law Center have been tracking hate crimes. There's evidence that hate speech predicts violence, that groups more exposed to hate speech are more likely to commit suicide, and that it causes what scientists have called the dehumanization effect. Makes it easier for us to justify suffering and harm caused to another human being. So I'm saying, like, this has real consequences, right? And of course, as a rep of the Racial Justice Task Force, the co-director of Social Justice Program, I will continually critically challenge and unequivocally resist white supremacy. So that's where I'm coming from. And with that, I'm gonna turn it over to my comrade, Albert Ponce. Albert, you're muted.
As my colleague Anthony Gonzalez says, that's a phrase of 2020, you're on mute. Right, so welcome everybody, and I think what Dr. Nyogi laid out is where I'm going to pick up from and really establish a critical analysis of the Constitution. So on this day, we reflect upon the Constitution, but for whom? And this title of Racing Space is something when I was reflecting and thinking about how race has spatially and temporally has been legislated, meaning who can occupy space, not only physically, geographically, but also in the imaginary or in the theoretical legal spectrum of citizenship. So from the founding moment, prefigurative to the founding of the Constitution, and thinking through my training as a political theorist, we build upon the social contract theorists who imagined a world in America where it was imagined as a blank slate. But the reality, and I just want to take a moment, as we're acknowledging the Constitution today, people were displaced. People were murdered. People were removed from the territory in order to enact a constitution. So who were those people? And how was this? And this is the famous painting of the signing of the Constitution. So I just want us to reflect on this painting today, and as we're asking questions and placing this as Professor Huff mentioned, the Constitution as a living document in our moment. How does it matter to us, to our children, to our generation, to our communities here, whether at DVC, Pleasant Hill, Martinez, Walnut Creek, Danville, Bay Point, Pittsburgh, Antioch, wherever we may be coming from, Richmond? Does the Constitution apply to us? And in the preamble to the Constitution, we have these great words, we the people. Who are the we? And this is a constant question that I have. Is it me? Who are the we? And this is something that as we walk around, and I'm always impressing upon my students, is constantly ask this question, and you'll get closer to an understanding of its material application, not only in history, but to yourself in your everyday practices. Are you included? Can you go out and mobilize and say, I have freedom of speech. I have the right to assemble, right? I have the right to freedom of expression. I have the right to enact a grievance. There are limits, as was laid out, to those rights. Those rights are contested. We mentioned at the outset, Julian Assange is being tried under the Espionage Act of 1917, right? Built upon previous Alien and Sedition Acts from 1798, built upon the expansion of this model of surveillance with the Homeland Security state, where some will argue some of our rights have been taken away in the Constitution. So as we're reflecting, this document is not a constant. And what I want us to situate ourselves upon, it is a settler colonial contract or a racial contract. What the philosopher Charles Mills says is simply, if we're willing to be realists, is willing to look at the facts without flinching, to explain that if you start with what we started, then you will end up with what we have here today. Disorder, people making claims to their basic humanity in order to be included into a constitution, right? So if we go back to this image, indigenous people, enslaved Africans, right? And Asians who were in the territory at the time, that's another forgotten history. Spaniards, Mexicans, not included. Women, not included. Claims are being made, constitutionally speaking, gendered, women, Equal Rights Amendment. We'll talk about that later too. And this is the cover of a book by indigenous scholar Nick Estes, Our History is the Future, who chronicles that long-standing tradition of resisting. They do not celebrate the Constitution today. They didn't celebrate it when they were being eliminated off the territory. So no enactment, as beautiful as it may sound, and those rights that were attributed in the first Bill of Rights, in the first 10 Bill of Rights, well, the 10 Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to our Constitution, were preserved for a particular class, socioeconomically speaking, gender, race, and others. So we know even those poor whites were cast out of that original form of citizenship and those rights that were attributed to it. So as we're thinking through this whole long durée, so to speak, of history, we tend to lose sight of the natives, right, who are still here, were there, and have always been resisting, because this Constitution never applied to them. And it wasn't until the year 1924 where they were actually given the opportunity to enter the realm of US citizenship, well into the 20th century, to even begin to make legal claims on that ground of citizenship. That was built upon the heels of the first US citizenship law, the 1790 Naturalization Act, which that class of gentlemen in that room, those 55 gentlemen, created US citizenship for themselves. So it was fundamentally racialized, the language in there. And that's the beauty of our historical record. If we're willing to look at the facts without flinching, we will learn more and become better people from it. But we know in our society, ideologically, people are driven by their ideas and are unwilling to examine how they came to a belief system, right? How they were politically socialized, gained their values and their beliefs from a society where racism is so natural that we don't see it, right? It is It's more American than apple pie, goes the saying. So that's what we're trying to undergird and get past. This current upheaval was set in stone with the Constitution in September 17th in the 18th century. And derivative of the Constitution, if we go, this is the language in the Constitution we're referring to enslaved Africans, right? So it even enshrined the right of that class of people, those citizens, to maintain domination over their property, meaning enslaved Africans. And even if they fled to free territories, it was constitutionally protected that they had to get their property back. Now we know there was a civil war and the 13th Amendment settled this issue and put this into the dustbin of history, so we thought. And this is something that great, and I have an image here of Eric Foner's great book titled The Second Founding, where he really chronicles the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, 13th to abolish slavery, except if you're for the punishment of a crime, and we'll talk about what we're dealing with now on the 13th Amendment, 14th, birthright citizenship and other clauses, and the 15th, the right to vote. Now, did that happen? Not yet. We needed another movement, right? And I say not yet because we're in election season. And I just have this up here to look at racial attitudes on our current moment, right? And this is a poll conducted August 2021, a pretty good sized poll, plus or minus 3.2 percentage points. And the question asks us, since the death of George Floyd in May, have you personally taken any actions to better understand racial issues in America? And this is just some data points to give us a better understanding, right? The group that is responded least to do anything, we see are white folks. And we know this is very heterogeneous along class, gender, and we know there are tons of what my former professor at Berkeley, Professor Walden Martin, called good white folks who are involved in every single movement. But they are the least resistant to interrogate their belief system or what they've inherited premised upon this Constitution that has guaranteed their rights and their advantage in a society, or what the political scientist Ira Kasnelson called affirmative action for whites. And we can take that back to that pact in the Constitution, and it has been reenacted from the New Deal to home ownership and its legacy in 2020 to the realm of segregation and socioeconomic class segregation along racial lines also. So, and the next slide, do you support or oppose the Black Lives Matter movement? Again, this is dropping, this is dipping. It was, as Professor Nyogi mentioned, there was more support back in June. That is dropping down, and I anticipate with all the heated rhetoric that we will see a further dip in support for BLM. And we see the group that opposes it the most are whites. And again, not to homogenize, there's a lot of heterogeneity within these categories, right? We have 17% of Blacks, 29% of Hispanics. And there's a class breakdown within these where the status quo level certain sectors of beliefs on going back to that myth of the nonviolent protester, do it the right way, that idea that destroying property is wrong. Well, we know one thing: we would not have a constitution, be speaking of a nation today, if violence wasn't enacted by those revolutionaries. That's one historical fact. And once we're looking at the development of the Constitution, we know, and this is not condoning or negating the right way to do it in the use of violence, but we know violence has produced change in every social movement. And another thing I want to focus on how space is raced constantly from that constitutional moment to the present are vagrancy laws. And vagrancy laws, if you've taken a history course, I think, yeah, we had some in California in the 1850s that targeted specifically Mexicans. They were so specific, they were known as the greaser laws, in order to displace them after the foreign miners tax and maintain control and the policing apparatus placed upon them. But this is what we also see. There's a great book written by Risa Golubov, who's the dean at the first female dean at the law school at the University of Virginia, called Vagrant Nation. And she's able to track sets of vagrant laws in all 50 states well up until the present, even after they were ruled unconstitutional in 1972. But when people are not supposed to be in certain spaces under their First Amendment right, it is the law enforcement apparatus which places them under surveillance, and in the realm of protest, also places them at the heels of forms potential violence or real violence. And this has been a constant, right? So this is historical. And here, there are those, if we go back to that modern day polling, I wanted to take us back to that 19th century pre-Civil War moment. And this is an ad in Boston in 1851, warning those enslaved Black folks who fled to free territories: do not talk to the police, right? Do not talk to the slave catchers. And I'm drawing focus on the police because that is the arm of the state which we most come in contact with, but also to draw the linkages to the past, to the present, because we don't understand police brutality today or a case of a bad apple or a few bad apples, and we just need some reforms. We need to go back and interrogate the whole history and the origins of law enforcement as the protectors of not only of racial domination, but of class domination, right? Which has remained in effect up until the present. So we see lots of this, around the country right now, where a lot of the movements for social justice are being co-opted, namely by law enforcement themselves, saying, we will reform ourselves, we'll get to it, let's sit down and talk. If we want real change in our society, constitutionally speaking, materially speaking, it should be all of us in this room, all of those who are engaged in movements, all of those who are being affected by the violence of the state to enact real change. It cannot be led by those who are inflicting the damage upon these communities. And here is an image of John Brown. And if you don't know John Brown, you should know John Brown, because John Brown, again, for his challenging the constitutionality of slavery, which was noted to be abolished in 1808. But in 1859, he launches an insurgency to free and abolish slavery. But this was seen as a threat to the state, and he was put to death. And I will be talking more about John Brown, but I just wanted to bring up this image as a white male who was committed to the struggle of abolition. And we have that struggle of abolition, and many of those folks committed to that today. So just to give us some historical context to some of the terms that are out there. So the racing of space continues into the 20th century. And on here, you also have an ad. What are you doing to maintain segregation? This is in 1963 in Alabama. This is the White Citizens Council asking other whites, what are they doing? Are they being neutral? They cannot remain neutral in maintaining domination over white space, whether the neighborhood, the park, the school, the church. And remind you, schools have been legally integrated at this moment. Materially, we know that's different. But legally, this is post-1954 Brown versus Board of Education. And here you have, on the other side, images of sundown towns, of Japanese, and letting people know explicitly. So a contemporary way that whites only, now we have multiple manifestations of it, right? All lives matter. That's again, erasing the particular subjectivities of those victims of violence historically. So the rights to space, the rights to assemble, and here is a right, well, we see two amendments that we're looking at. The first, the right to peacefully assemble and to petition. These are the Black Panthers who in 1967 at the state capitol here in Sacramento, carrying their guns, right, to defend their communities from police violence. And quickly, those in power enact the Mulford Act to remove and strip their Second Amendment rights, right? Where even the National Rifle Association supported limits on open carry because of who was carrying them. Black men with rifles to defending their community, asserting their dignity and their defense for themselves. So you need to establish a law to strip that, and we've been without weapons in California ever since, as far as at this level. So space is raced. Rights that are in our Constitution do not apply to everyone. Just a few days ago, August 29th, 1970, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Chicano moratorium. And here are some images of that day that we celebrated, originally from Los Angeles. And you have an image here of this child holding a sign, bring an end to police brutality in Los Angeles against the Chicano community. People amassed carrying those same signs just a couple weeks ago in the same spot to honor 50 years, where not much has changed. For Black and brown communities who bear the brunt of the violence and the purview of the state, meaning the law enforcement. And this does not matter if we're speaking of more Latino cops. It is Latino cops who are committing those acts in the name of the state. Or you have more Black cops in Oakland. Is that going to solve the issue? No. Or more Irish cops going to solve the issue of beating Irish Republicans in Northern Ireland? That didn't solve the issue either. Right? The role of the police agencies are to control levels of power. And now here's some more images of the police violence that was enacted on that day at the Chicano moratorium. But I want to bring your attention to this image here, because here we have an LA County sheriff ready to fire and assassinate Ruben Salazar. Ruben Salazar was a sole voice in the media in Los Angeles for this marginalized community who had no voice, very limited. And when they enacted their voice, they were repressed. So the only reporter for the LA Times on that day, he was murdered, and this LA Sheriff's Department still attempting to cover it up until the present moment. And we know most acts of violence come from the state. This is a report from Amnesty International, where law enforcement has violated Black Lives Matter protesters, human rights documents, acts of police violence as excessive force. And these are hundreds and hundreds. So I will begin to wrap it up now, but I want to end with one clause that has been held up as constitutional. Pearson v. Ray, 1967. And this is the clause of qualified immunity, which insulates and protects law enforcement or any members of the state when they enact these violations. And this is something that has been has withstood multiple tests in court. And I will pause there as we move now. But I wanted to end with this: how democratic is the Constitution? And that was Thurgood Marshall, their first African-American Black Supreme Court Justice, leader of the NAACP Legal Counsel. Just to state simply the facts, it was defective from the start. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ponce and Dr. Nyogi, for your presentations. I'd like to thank everybody for your comments. Some of us are over chatting it up in the chat area. I've been putting a bunch of links, different things to what folks are talking about. I think that both Albert and Sangha can put their email addresses there if you were interested in contacting anyone. And would like to remind you all that for this Constitution Day event, something that I say at these things yearly, it seems now, is that just in general, a lot of the information that we're talking about here, this is publicly available, but it should also be public knowledge. These are the very kind of things upon which we should be building our conversations, our dialogues. These are the things that our media and the press should be resting upon and helping further our conversations, not framing them myopically for ratings and sensationalism. So it's important too then that we have that information about what the Constitution actually says and what it means and what the different perspectives are. I'm always reminded from a book from a number of years ago that it was 1 in 4. It was 25% of people in the U.S. could name at least 5 members of the fictitious Simpsons family from the long-running cartoon The Simpsons, right? But only 1 in 1,000 could name all 5 rights protected under the First Amendment. So one takeaway from that is it's difficult to exercise rights you don't know you have or don't understand that you have. And, Interestingly, I've been in classrooms at DVC where students are talking about how we do not have the rights to assemble, or we don't have the right to disagree with government. And they're just baffling statements to me that people would even suggest that kind of a thing. So on some just even rudimentary level, we have a lot of work to do to remind people that these rights don't enforce themselves. And as both Drs. Ponce and Yogi mentioned, there can be some real consequences societally when we don't take these responsibilities seriously. So with that, I would like to, of course, you'll notice my friend and colleague Nolan Higdon is reminding everybody of our Critical Media Literacy Conference of the Americas on decolonizing the media. That's a free conference. You can see it in the chat room. That's October 17 and 18. Since I'm doing a quick announcement here, also Boots Riley will be at DVC October 7. I know Albert and Sangha have a lot of events coming up for social justice series to get into. And also don't forget that the week of September 27th is Banned Books Week, celebrating the right to read, since we're talking about the First Amendment, and I'll be covering that at the Project Censored Show this week as well. Friday, 1 p.m., KPFA, shameless plug. That said, I know we're joined too by Michael Leviton, who's the new faculty member and advisor for the DVC Inquirer. Michael, did you want to say anything about how you see the journalism program at DVC maybe fitting into this? And then we certainly want to go in the time we have remaining to all of our participants, all the people who are here. Michael, was there anything you'd like to say?
Very briefly, just to introduce myself, really a pleasure hearing all of you speak. That was a really multifaceted, comprehensive view of the Constitution and our history. And just to remind people, a social movement. So I'm a new faculty journalism professor here and advising the Inquirer, as Mickey said. We had a few stories this past week, one today, which certainly confirms sort of the importance of the free press right on the campus, the ability to analyze and dissect and criticize when necessary and reveal flaws in even our own government, our own district management, which is what we're currently, the staff is writing about right now with everything happening to our district. So that seems a very appropriate example published on Constitution Day, just by coincidence, of the importance that, that our student journalists learn in the process, that confronting power when it's uncomfortable, when it's accurate, when it's fairly done and appropriately done, but the difficulty of doing that. And obviously in the real world, major risks incurred, as Mickey brought up with Julian Assange and everything else. But I think our students are learning those lessons. And one lesson, just one thing to point out in case people aren't aware, today, September 17th, is the founding day of the Occupy Wall Street movement, which was appropriately launched on the day of the Constitution 9 years ago today in 2011, September 17th in New York City. I was part of that movement. That social movement really helped frame my view of the role of the press and of citizens to speak out. I was part of it. I was part of the media creation of it, helping produce the newspaper, the Occupied Wall Street Journal, that we founded there. And I think that movement also, when we look at all these images that Albert and Sangha, I mean, everything from Black Lives Matter and Standing Rock and this explosion of social movements and protests in the last decade, I would just say that Occupy Wall Street 9 years ago today helped bring much of this to the fore, because police and the security state came out in force against that movement. And I think Americans for the first time saw in many years kind of the brutality and the willingness to beat back peaceful protesters who are here to protest corruption on Wall Street and in Washington. And so just to bring that movement back to people's attention and get it circling again. Thank you all.
So Michael Leviton, thank you so much for sharing that with us. It's great to have a full-time professor in journalism again, and it's an honor to chair there and work with my colleagues across campus. Anybody who has a story to tell, and that's all of us, get a hold of Michael Leviton, get a hold of the editors. We're rebuilding the website for the newspaper, and we're also working on some multimedia, podcasting, a lot of other things going on there. And remember that this is your campus newspaper and your community voice. You're part of that community, so take advantage of that platform. So get in touch with Professor Leviton if you're at all interested. So that said, I would love to open it up for others. We have time. I know that the event alleges to go until 1:45, but we can easily go until 2 o'clock. If people can stick around, I'm happy to hang out for as long as people want, actually. I'm not speaking for other people. I'm only speaking for myself. Uh, but again, I'd like to open it up to you all. So is there anybody out there that I know there's been some great comments and remarks in the chat room. I've tried to respond to some of them. I've also been posting various links to articles, books, documentaries, contact information. Please feel free to utilize those. Please feel free to be in contact. But with that, if you would like to have a say, could you please sort of notify or unmute yourself and talk to everyone here, please? That invitation is open. 74 people, open invitation. I have no problem filling the remaining time. But
Andy, did you want to say something?
Oh, hi. Okay, I'm on the spot. I just wanted to say, I have been writing a piece on the DVC's YDSA, right? Attempting or trying to sorry, I'm on the spot right now. Basically just circulating a petition to defund the campus police, right? And one thing that I was recommended to do, right, was contact the campus police, right? So actually this morning, right, I contacted the I believe the lieutenant of the campus police, who then just to ask them basically, do you have any comment on it, right? And of course I was directed to the chief of campus police, and I just got a voicemail, right? So I think it's interesting, right, how like even through like the most basic ways that those with authority in our society should be reachable, right? Like just being able to contact the police, not even to put them on the spot, right, but to say, hey, do you have an opinion on what others are thinking of the job you're doing? They don't even want to do that, right?
if that's your experience and you're writing for the paper, correct?
Right, because I wanted to, tell both sides of this, or I mean, I I wanted to, but I was also informed that yeah, it would be a good idea, right, to get both sides of the story, right, and I think just personally, right, me looking at it from a PR perspective, right, it would like if I was on the campus police, it would be so easy to come across and say, oh, well, we respect the right of people to, democratically request action, whether we agree with that or not, right? But the fact that they just say, oh, we have no comment, right, shows to me that there's like a certain level of entitlement, right, where, oh, we don't have to give you what we think of anything, right? And I mean, whether that's because they probably don't think very, shall we say, charitably about the move to defund, the campus police. And then also, right, I don't think they need to say anything, because looking at it, from the perspectives, right, of the power differential, right? I mean, of course, a lot of students, and I'm assuming also a lot of faculty, have signed the petition circulated by the YDSA. But at the end of the day, the campus police are the ones with the institutional power, right? So I suppose it does, from a certain perspective, make sense that they would say this, because why should they, have to be, why should they have to even put something out there when they are the ones going into this with sort of the institutional the institutional might, per se, right?
So Albert and Songha, do you want to address that at all, or perhaps Michael? Although I know Michael, you're certainly in the middle of that conversation.
Right. It was
I
actually Michael, to his credit, who recommended that I do contact the campus police
Yeah.
in order to, get
Right.
that.
As a journalist, just
Oh,
to go get a comment.
Right. And that was right of him to do, right? Because you at least, even like in this case where they don't want to, right? I'm sure it's, it comes across, not only is it the right thing to do to get both sides of a story, even if you may disagree with it, but it also reflects better on you, right, to say we tried to get both sides, but this side, didn't want to comment, right? Sorry, I've been hogging the floor.
And it speaks to the national, Andrew, just to add in, it speaks to the national conflict that was raised by Black Lives Matter, in that, Blue Lives Matter, the whole that backlash by cops, the nationwide kind of cop supporting community that felt like in the reporting of these incredible protests, who was really asking cops their side. Okay, maybe they didn't have a right to even really have a comment in this situation, but that response stemmed from the inability of the kind of progressive and of the media to even bother to ask that side what their opinion was. I think that is what we're trying to reflect here.
Right. It's sort of like a polarization in the discourse, for sure.
So it's always important journalistically to go and reach out to as many different constituencies and groups as possible. I know we've been inviting people here to come to the Inquirer and do that because we do want to hear from people. But it, of course, is the role of journalists from student level all the way up to go out into the communities and get their opinions and the voices of the very people that are at the center of these really important stories. So I would say it's very important that you then reach out, particularly to the police in this case. And if you're unable to get any feedback from them, then unfortunately that's what you have to report, right? But so Dr. Simone, you had a couple things you wanted to bring up here. One of them was the so-called Patriotic Education in 1776 Commission, and also to point, of course, the 1619 Project, which is currently being attacked again, this time all the way up to the White House level. And this is age old, as someone that teaches history by day, the assaults against academic freedom and whose stories are told is age old. Whether you go back 20 years to David Horowitz, who was trying to teach against reparations movements, or you look at the repeated attacks against Howard Zinn, or others where, the governor of, I believe it was Indiana, tried to actually ban his works from college campuses. On the surface of it, this stuff is absurd and ludicrous. Now we see the same thing happening with the 1619 Project. By the way, that doesn't mean the 1619 Project isn't open for criticism, interpretation, and academic dialogue and discourse. It is, however, more generally that this is a mainstream infusion of hearing different narratives into a broad academic setting where those topics haven't really been at the center or the forefront of the pedagogy and of the curriculum. So I think that it's important that we take a look at whose stories are being told and why. And of course, Songha and Albert, do you have anything to say about either of those issues from Dr. Simone?
No, just to carry that, this has been the whole history, right? And that's why today we're presenting a critical examination of the Constitution, because it's been one story that has been told. And today, traditionally, the state mandates some type of celebratory, and let's move on, look at the great ideals. There are great ideals in there. We can talk about that. But the reality is now when you try to, in the curriculum, and I always state, knowledge is not power. You need to have power in order to disseminate the knowledge. So if you are the state, you select the books for the children to read. That is powerful, right? And once you begin to challenge now children who have grown up and have come to college, and people become unsettled, and that's good. That's part of the educated process, right? Where we become really open and destabilized. But people who are doing very well, going back to that poll, how many people have done something to want to understand racial issues in the contemporary moment? Not very many, right? So once you try to educate the children with a different perspective, that begins to destabilize the set of the way power was formed from this constitutional moment to the present, which has been very linear, very subjective, but it's been sold as objective. And that's where ethnic studies comes in. That's where gender studies comes in. That's where this multi-intersectional analysis and critique comes in order to gain a bigger, better, more comprehensive understanding. Okay.
Yeah, no, I want to give room to people who may want to say something more, but very quickly, the most exciting part for me is that our students are leading, our students are engaged. And irrespective of whether you agree with their position or not, I think just as teachers, we are all so psyched about that, you know, it's a student-led thing and they are the ones leading us in so many things. So that's exciting.
So John and Clarice, could you talk to the growing national movements and organizations, including MPP, DSA, OR, PPC, that's the activists alphabet soup there, their potential to bring about meaningful change and the possibility that they can also become co-opted. I know the whole corporate performative wokeness, and you know, we're supposed to somehow believe that Nike is interested in Black Lives Matter while they have 12-year-old Vietnamese girls making people's tennis shoes. That's a real glaring contradiction in our society. Levi Stadium flying the Black Lives Matter flag for the San Francisco 49ers in Santa Clara, yet they have slavery as a major issue in their supply chain. Those are pretty significant issues that need to be called out. But would you all like to talk to the issues brought forward by John and Clarice?
So I'll just say briefly, every movement, there are attempts to co-opt them, right? Either wherever they start out ideologically as movements who are on fire, and within the movements you have very, again, heterogeneous ideas and beliefs by those actors within those social movements. So some are more reformist and some are calling for, if we go back to John Brown, he was an abolitionist in that era. There were people who say, well, we got to make slavery a little more nicer, right? And the idea of abolition in that era, just as it is today, is seen as something far-fetched. You're extreme, right? So those people who are co-opted themselves. So there's always that potential. I'll leave it. Saga, you want to say something on that?
I was looking at other questions here too, and one that folks are bringing up is about, again, folks like Milo coming to campus and how we respond to that. Of course, part of it is, of course, like not just, I think even at our campus, one of the things that we've dealt with is hate speech consistently over time in our bathrooms, and we've been tagged by white supremacist groups and so on. And of course, it has to be about like organizing and making sure we're not reactive, that, you know, we have ways of making sure that we're online, offline, we're posting in a way that everyone knows what we're about, what our values are, affirming that, naming it, right? Not like sweeping things under the rug. Absolutely. So more free speech, yes. But what really gets me is that we're always struggling to find resources for marginalized groups, but we spend like tons of money on just organizing security for these folks who have no credentials. Like, I don't know why they are speaking. Like, what is their expertise? Like, why is the university spending any money to, so for me, it's like, how are they adding any value, right?
And that's just not to cut you off, but just to add to that. So the university, the college, it's a space for us to engage in academic ideas that will lead society better. So anybody can say anything. You have that First Amendment right. But as an institution, are you going to expend the resources towards something that has no academic grounding? We all write research papers. You need evidence, right? So there is no evidence. This is just hyperbolic, which could descend into, not all of it is hate speech, but some is, right? And there are effects leading towards violence. So why should any university, which has built its prestige upon building enlightening individuals and building forms of knowledge and scientific research, give a platform and then pay these people. That's the thing. So they have the right to say it across the street in the parking lot.
My 2 cents on that, having been embroiled in quite a number of academic freedom issues, as has Albert, of course, and others, I think that at least in this regard, when we're talking, you're specifically mentioning people like Milo Yiannopoulos and others, I maybe come down in a slightly different area, although I agree with everything that was just said. I'm pretty stalwart in my position opposing censorship. Although that doesn't mean everybody needs to get every platform all the time, as what Dr. Ponce was just alluding to in terms of how we use resources. But I would also suggest that, given that there may be different constituencies and groups on campus that want to hear different voices and different opinions and maybe even debates, I think that that's a pretty decent way of handling those situations. Rather, and if there's a speaker coming and you don't like what they're saying, you have every right to protest that event. Interestingly enough, how it connects to what we're saying here today, right? It means too that we have the right to disagree, and we need to learn how to agree to disagree, and we need to learn how to think critically. But as Sangha mentioned earlier, and as Albert has long said, we also need to be mindful of very different kinds of toxic speech or hate speech. And for some people, it's a very fine line. Legally, there are others that think that they can draw that line maybe somewhere different than we all want to. So I just try to be careful to not be perceived as someone that wants to shut down or censor ideas. I'd rather debate these people. I would actually love to sit down with Milo Yiannopoulos for 5 minutes and debate him, because it probably wouldn't be much of a debate. As Albert just suggested, when people don't have a lot to back up what they're saying, and there's a lot of hot air involved, it shouldn't take long to intellectually dismantle their arguments, which in my view is one of the best ways to illustrate not only the importance of free speech and debate, but to also remember that part of free speech and expression and its protection with the free press is so that we have the opportunity to change not only our own positions and minds, but maybe the minds of others. And one thing that is an unfortunate fallout is that whenever certain characters, particularly, this is from right to left, but whenever people are censored, you've kind of given them this extra issue that they're now going to flog for a long time. Like David Horowitz made a career of it at Front Page Magazine, the far-right publication, where he will go out and say far out, outlandish, factually unsupported things. He'll target college newspapers and target college audiences, and then he'll cry censorship when people try to discuss or debate him. He wrote a whole book about it on dangerous professors. We're seeing the same thing happen right now, and Albert, of course, was sadly at the receiving end of a campaign of censorship and silencing academic freedom at DVC a number of years ago that thankfully our faculty senate and our administration stood up to. And it took a while, but we did draft a very strong and important statement about academic freedom. And I think that that's really something that we need to hang our hats on, particularly when we are in really quite contentious times. So
3 things very quickly about that. 1, these folks are not interested in intellectual debate.
Many of them are not.
Or any of that discourse. 2nd, they will always claim victimhood irrespective. 3rd, I am scared for the lives of my students who have somehow made it to college despite everything historically as well. For them to sit there and hear that, right? They are my priority. So I'm just open about that. I'm not gonna support a person who's gonna talk about their very right to exist, right? And attack that. So I will never stand for that.
Who else wants to chime in here? We're coming up on 2 o'clock. I know that we were technically finished a little while ago, but we're still here and we're more than willing to talk to folks. There's still 51 people
You'll be here all day. So.
participating. So who else wants to chime in here?
Sangha's point, I was going to say, Sangha, you bring up a good point. That I think it was Richard Dawkins. There was a protest to get him not to speak at in Berkeley, which is a whole nother debate. But they did ask him if instead of a lecture, if he would do like an in-conversation discussion, and he refused.
Mm-hmm.
So one way could be to, if you are, again, I don't understand why you want to have Milo on your campus, but let's say you were, to try and set up to be a dialogue rather than a lecture. But I think to Song Han's point, that probably wouldn't make Milo want to come.
Dialogue is really, what's at the center of academic freedom and intellectual debate. So we should try to encourage it when possible.
And can I just say one thing?
I think is that
Yeah, your audio is very distorted.
Oh,
There it is. It's better.
Okay, awesome. What I just wanted to say too is that a lot of these right-wing provocateurs, when they like debate people, right?
because a lot of
The crux of their arguments rely on this perception that the left is sort of this group of easily offended, almost like childlike figures. And the thing they do to do this, right, is they debate these like first-year university students who don't really have much experience, debating in like a environment in which it's moderated, and they have an opponent who knows like the rules and how to properly debate, right? I think the best example of this is Ben Shapiro, where you'll see all these videos on YouTube of Ben Shapiro destroys whiny crybaby leftist in debate, right? But then I forgot who it was, but I remember Ben Shapiro agreed to a debate with this popular left-wing figure, because it was an actual moderated debate, right? And he couldn't just rely on talking really fast and spitting out a lot of talking points so fast that people didn't have time to react, right? He didn't have really the upper hand, right? And so, but I also do see the other side of it, in which that, it is sort of a fine line to walk, because, I see both the merit of both sides, because on one hand, right, if you not necessarily refuse to engage them, but refuse to platform them, then that gives them the ability to cry censorship. But at the same time, right, if you allow like someone like Milo or Gavin McInnes, the founder of, to my knowledge, of the Proud Boys, right, to come and speak on campus, right, it does, at the very least, create a unsafe environment for persons of color, LGBTQ people, right, especially gender non-conforming people, right? So it's, and I'm going to be brutally honest here, I don't have the answer, but I feel like there is like a lot of these people, when exposed to like an actual debate, will flounder, right? Because they're so used to it like just talking really fast in front of like freshman university students, that when they have to face like an actual contender who's on the same, or more often than not, a higher intellectual level than they are, not to sound pretentious or anything, they sort of, flounder. Sorry. Sorry.
Yeah, no,
Sorry if I...
all good and important points. Thank you so much for sharing those. Anybody want to address those, or are there others that want to participate? I don't know, Tristan, if you wanted to talk before or not. I just saw your screen pop up. I just want to make sure that other folks get a chance to talk if they'd like to.
Yeah, I can say something, Mickey.
Okay, hold on a moment, John. Tristan, did you?
Yeah, I just had a quick question. It's kind of in a different vein of discussion, but it was related to what you were saying at the beginning about the Assange trial. Could you really unpack, or like, this is open for everyone, like, what are the implications of the Assange trial if it, I believe they're trying to extradite him to then have it. If that goes through, what does that mean for the intersection of free speech and national security, and how like those two things interact? And how might we see that applied like with the racial theory aspect to it? How might that be applied to marginalize more groups? Is that an unnecessary tool? And to say that, is the toolbox already so big that, this is just another piece of precedent that would just be, used in with many other things? So that was my question.
So Songhan Albert can talk to the second point. I can mention the first. I just interviewed Kevin Gostola. on the Assange trial. That'll air tomorrow at 1 o'clock in KPFA. I put in the links over here in the chat area, links to shadowproof.com with Kevin's writing. Consortium News has been addressing exactly these very issues. We at Project Censored have long talked about the significance of the Assange case and what it portends journalistically, which is very important. The argument that's being made by the U.S. is one that states that Assange isn't a journalist. But even as someone who's a publisher, again, who defines what a journalist is? Do you have to, if you don't work for the corporate media, are you somehow not a journalist if that's what you do for your trade? It's a problematic tactic. But to show further why this is significant for journalism in particular, the Freedom of the Press Foundation and Trevor Timm, who testified at Assange's trial this week, noted that Assange is a pioneer in the technological means by which people have been leaking information. And the reason that information is leaked, going back to people like Daniel Ellsberg, is because the government doesn't want us to know about it. And in the past, like with Ellsberg, our major traditional media institutions, like the New York Times, for example, actually worked with him and went through the documents and made them public. And President Nixon tried to shut them down all the way to the Supreme Court, and thankfully, for free press rights, lost. Now, in the case of Assange and free press issues with Secure Drop, for example, Tim noted at the trial, over 70 major news organizations around the entire globe, from the BBC to the New York Times and across the gamut, rely on Secure Drop links to do journalism. And what would happen if you have a conviction of somebody like Assange? It would then make not only the Press Freedom Foundation and the Secure Drop liable for criminal prosecution, but arguably any outlet that reported any information that could be traced to it. Just roll that around in your mind in terms of what that means for press freedom, right? And so at least I'll stop it there. I could go on about it, but I'm happy to talk more offline. I just want to make sure that either Sangha or Albert, if they want to address the second part of your question.
No, I was just, you hit it. We can go on forever on this. The implications are huge. Right? And this is the arbitrariness, right, of when national security is called in and basically can take away suspend the Constitution as a whole. And also one thing I didn't mention, I did mention when you're on the racial element, when you have a journalist of color, say Ruben Salazar for one, who was assassinated by the sheriff, or people on the street today who have been taken beatings or arrested or tear gassed. When people peacefully assemble, it's an arbitrary choice by the officials on the ground to declare it an unlawful assembly. Stating those two words, this is unlawful assembly, strips away your right, your First Amendment right in that moment. And if you stay in that space at that moment, you will pay the consequences, either with a beating or an arrest.
Sangha, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, not much more to add, just that folks of color have expressed solidarity with Assange, and he has shed light on oppression on people of color throughout the world. So,
oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And a federal court recently ruled that it was lawful for Snowden to leak NSA spying documents to Glenn Greenwald. By the way, let's not forget that Snowden tried to do the same thing that Chelsea Manning tried to do, which was the same thing that Daniel Ellsberg tried to do, which was give this information over to major media outlets. But in Manning's case, they passed on it, even though we're talking about the collateral murder videos and war crimes videos that they then threw him in prison for 35 years until Obama commuted his sentence. Ironically, while Obama was the president that prosecuted more whistleblowers than every president in history combined. Interesting story. But also Snowden, the same thing was claimed about him, is that he's a high-tech terrorist and a Russian spy. The reason that Snowden is still in Russia is because that's where Secretary of State John Kerry rescinded his passport, so he couldn't travel anywhere. He didn't go there to have tea with Putin any more than Assange works for Putin. But that all kind of gets wrapped up into these corporate media narratives And again, it's unfortunate. So at any rate, who else wants to chime in here? We have time for one or two more folks.
Yeah, I had something to say.
Go ahead, John.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I didn't want to cut you off. Yeah. On the whole Assange thing, we just have this whole constant barrage of this new Red Scare stuff about Russia being responsible for everything, even when that's not accurate. But what I was going to say was about some of this stuff earlier about hate speech. My main concern with having more, I guess, exceptions to the First Amendment carved out against hate speech. I'm not in favor of hate speech, obviously, but my concern is how that would inevitably be politically weaponized. I mean, even right now, we have in multiple states, we have massive mobilizations politically against people who participate in boycott, divestment, and sanction of Israel. And I feel like there would be concerted effort on behalf of organizations like AIPAC, and I think the ADL also is involved in these things, to brand people who are, expressing their opinion in favor of, the intellectual boycott of Israel because of the occupation of territories of Palestine in violation of international law, to brand that as anti-Semitism. And if we had significant carve-outs of the First Amendment for hate speech, I feel like they would try to bundle that along with it. And I just don't trust the state to be able to successfully navigate the nuances of that in a way that would not end up making things worse than they already are.
Sangha, Albert?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question on, and not really, I don't know if I understood the first part about maybe an amendment to the speech, but just in practice, we see, specifically on BDS, right? So we see lots of repression, and we know the case of Steven Salaita, for instance, where tweeting. So freedom of speech does not, they went after him, he lost his job, he's now driving a school.
Lamar, Norm Finkelstein.
Folks, where there's a lot of power of academics being removed, being censored. So there are big consequences. I get your point, but I don't know if, Sandra, do you want to add to this? I know we're going past time. I didn't want to.
Right, very quickly, I'll try to keep it concise. So what we know is that historically it has been very skewed. Everybody agrees on that, right? Like there are historically marginalized groups in the US for centuries of oppression, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not gonna go into that. But so it's very skewed right now. So all we are arguing is that there are groups who have been historically oppressed, dehumanized. And I'm also saying we take this very seriously, right? It's not like, oh, this is offensive, you're done, canceled, you're canceled. So I'm not saying that at all. I'm arguing this is an empirical question. We have data, science, and I'm saying that let's discuss it, talk about it. Let's not passively say that's the First Amendment thing. Let's engage with it, right? That's all I'm saying, right? And think about it case by case and see if there is a way to have, of course, this really important right of freedom of expression, but how do we make it so that the right is actually implemented for folks who've never had that right? That's all I'm saying. And CRT is offering us, critical race theory is offering us maybe certain ways in which, of course, we still look at it empirically, but we're looking at maybe we can come up with some protocols.
Well, Dr. Nyogi and Dr. Ponce, thank you so much for not just your participation, but so much of the work that you do on and off campus, co-directors of our social justice program here at DVC. So if you want to get more involved with that, please be in touch with them, or Daniela or Erica, who were here earlier. Also, I'm proud to teach with the social justice program. I'm co-teaching the course right now with Dr. Ponce. Sangha taught it last term with Terrence Elliott. Looks like we might be teaching it again, Albert, in spring. So if you're interested in these kind of conversations and this these kinds of pursuits academically, feel free to tell your friends, tell people that maybe aren't your friends that you think maybe need to hear more of these kinds of discussions, and send them our way. It's the more the merrier, and I would like to see these conversations go far and wide across the DVC campus, and with the help of the Inquirer, out into our local communities. So I wanted to thank Dr. Nyogi, Dr. Ponce, Professor Levitin. I want to thank all the student, staff, faculty, and all the members of the community. There were some community members here and some other people from outside DVC. So I want to thank you all for coming. Certainly thank Todd Farr in the Student Life Office. Thank you so much for coming. Our contact infos and all these links are in the chat room. So I'll figure out with Todd Farr what we're going to do with the recording, and I'll make sure that we're able to make it available for other students, faculty, staff, and community, because obviously it may be something that's useful in your classes or to start other kind of conversations. So that said, I want to thank everybody for coming. Again, it was an honor to be invited to do this, and I'm just really happy that we had so many people turn out and so many great comments and really great questions. So Albert or Sangha, any last words?
Yes, I just want to say, join us next Thursday, the 24th, for we'll have an ACLU, Christina Fletes Romo, ACLU voting rights lawyer, on talk on voter suppression. Something very
and we are planning our Social Justice Day in November. We still have time. If you folks have any ideas, email us.
I hope to see you all next week.
All right. Thanks so much, everybody. If anybody, I'll hang out here for a couple of minutes. If anybody wants to linger, you had a couple things you wanted to say or maybe wanted to ask, and maybe you didn't feel comfortable with other people around or whatever, I'll hang out here until everybody drops out. Albert and Sangha, again, thanks so much for everything. Greatly appreciated.
Yeah.